Sadie grinned as she brushed the dirt off her hands. A bad, strong smell filled the air as she looked at the yard in front of her. She felt pleased. Her neighbor had been using her for too long, and now she was getting even. He wouldn't get away with it anymore. All she had to do now was wait. Sadie Foster had had enough. For weeks, she had watched helplessly as one of her neighbors messed up her yard. She often saw the man jump over her fence, land in her flower beds, and head into the street. He was using her yard as a shortcut. She had asked him many times to stop, but he ignored her. She was done being polite. Standing by the window, Sadie kept her eyes fixed on the yard. She had been carefully watching the man's routine for weeks. If everything went as planned, he would jump over the fence any minute now. She couldn't wait. She had prepared for this moment. Today, she was going to teach him a lesson. Sipping her hot coffee, she could barely contain her excitement. The man had been taking advantage of her yard for too long, but now he was about to face the consequences. Her eyebrows lifted as she spotted movement on the other side of the fence. Just like every morning, the man threw his bag into her yard. This time, though, it landed right in her trap. With a grin, Sadie watched him pull himself over the fence and, as usual, drop into her flower bed. But instead of landing on soft flowers, he fell into something gross. From where she stood, Sadie could see the shock on his face. Then she heard it. His scream echoed through the yard and into her house. With a grin, the older woman placed her cup on a nearby counter and made her way toward the door. He had gotten away with this for far too long, and she was going to laugh in his face. He had fallen straight into her trap. Ex-Marine Sadie Foster was living her best life in Phoenix, Arizona. Having retired just a few months prior, she was enjoying a quiet life in the suburbs. Although she hadn't been there for long, her neighbors had made her feel right at home. But there was one neighbor who got on her nerves. His name was Owen, and he had no respect for her boundaries. Owen's house was situated right behind Sadie's, and there was one thing they did not agree on. Every morning, Owen had to take a bus into town. In order to get to the bus stop, he would have to walk around the block, but he had discovered a shortcut through Sadie's yard. This took him about 10 minutes on his journey. But there was one glaring problem. Whenever he hopped the fence and landed in Sadie's yard, he would trample one of her flower beds. Over time, this completely destroyed the flowers she had grown. She had spoken to him about the issue, but he didn't seem to care. It was a Monday morning. Sadie had just woken up and was in the process of brewing a pot of coffee. As she walked to the sink, she glanced out the window that overlooked her yard. It was at that moment she caught Owen in the act. He tossed his bag over the fence, and a second later, he hopped over too. Sadie watched with narrowed eyes. She had confronted him about this the day before, but her words had gone in one ear and out the other. He had no respect for her boundaries. With a hand on her hip, she watched as the man casually walked through her yard. The flower bush he had jumped into was flattened, and she was furious. He had no idea who he was messing with. As an ex-Marine, Sadie had gotten used to solving problems with a more hands-on approach. This wasn't the first time she had asked him to stop, but he just wouldn't listen. She was going to get her revenge, if it was the last thing she ever did. She stood motionless before the window, planning her next move. It took some time, but she knew just what to do. That afternoon, while Owen was away at work, Sadie began putting her plan into action. If he wasn't going to respect her wishes on his own, she would punish him. It was just past noon when the older woman hopped into her car and made her way to the nearest nursery. She had thought of the perfect way to get back at her obnoxious neighbor. It took no longer than 10 minutes for Sadie to find exactly what she was looking for. She got 2 male employees to help her carry the bags to her car before heading back home. She had to work fast. She didn't want Owen to suspect anything, but she couldn't wait to see his reaction once he stepped into her trap. She couldn't stop smirking as she made her way home. As soon as she returned from the store, she headed into the garden. Thick gloves covered her hands, and rubber boots protected her feet as she dragged the 2 heavy bags with her. Cutting them open, she got to work, covering the soil and plants with thick compost. The smell was overwhelming, but she knew it would pay off. She decided to empty both bags into the small flower bed that her neighbor had been abusing for so long. She wondered if her little prank would finally be enough to make him stop trampling her flowers. Once the ground was covered in a thick layer of compost, the older woman grabbed a hose. She spent the next 30 minutes soaking the compost, making sure it was wet and muddy. Her intention was to ruin the man's entire day. The smell was horrible, but that's exactly what she wanted. Sadie wasn't one for pranks, but she felt this rude neighbor deserved it. His constant trampling of her flower beds had pushed her to act, and she felt justified. She had set the perfect trap with a smirk, satisfied that her revenge was coming. Her neighbor Owen had taken advantage of her yard for too long, and now she was sure he'd learn his lesson. After setting the compost trap, she cleaned up and eagerly awaited morning. Too excited to sleep, she knew Owen would jump the fence at 7:30, just like always. With coffee in hand, she watched from the window, anticipating the moment her carefully planned prank would unfold. Today was the day she would finally teach him a lesson. Sadie's senses were on high alert. She knew she was in immediate danger, but she still didn't know from where. Would she be able to save herself? Sadie tensed every muscle in her body, preparing for an attack. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Now that she knew where the threat was coming from, she could defend herself. A flash of brown fur darted across the lawn, making a beeline for the compost. Sadie acted on pure instinct and adrenaline. She rushed toward the creature, wanting to get a better look before she made her move. Her body moved automatically, muscle memory kicking in from her old training days. She cut the creature off and stared it down. Finally, she was close enough to identify what it was, but it was nothing like she had imagined. The animal froze as soon as Sadie stepped between it and the compost heap. She stared it down, but when she realized what it was, she let out a deep breath. It wasn't exactly the threat she had anticipated. Maybe her senses were all mixed up. Standing before her was a brown rat. Could the small creature have been what set off her instincts? As Sadie tried to make sense of the situation, she heard a sound to her left. Immediately, she got back on the defensive. The noise was subtle, but she knew what to listen for from her military days. It was the sound of something moving across leaves, not stepping on them, but being dragged. Horror washed over her as she realized she was about to face the real threat. The sound triggered a memory of one of her deployments where she had stalked through the desert, keeping an eye out for mines and IEDs. But she had encountered something else on that patrol, a long, scaly, and extremely venomous creature. Little did she know, that experience would prepare her for an event years later. Snapping back to the present, Sadie immediately knew how to face this new danger. She remembered how she had faced the fanged creature before and prepared herself just in time as she heard a low hiss. A second later, it happened. The serpent launched itself out of a nearby bush toward Sadie. She braced herself for the worst. Sadie was ready to defend herself, but then she noticed something unexpected. The snake wasn't going for her, it was going for the rat. The rat barely managed to escape through a hole in the fence. Defeated, the snake slithered away, and Sadie had no idea where it went, but she wasn't going to wait around to find out. However, later, this would spell trouble for her revenge plan. It seems Sadie wasn't the only one attracted by the smell of the compost she had spread in her garden. Sadie wasn't one for pranks, but she felt this rude neighbor deserved it. His constant trampling of her flower beds had pushed her to act, and she felt justified. She had set the perfect trap with a smirk, satisfied that her revenge was coming. Her neighbor Owen had taken advantage of her yard for too long, and now she was sure he'd learn his lesson. After setting the compost trap, she cleaned up and eagerly awaited morning. Too excited to sleep, she knew Owen would jump the fence at 7:30, just like always. With coffee in hand, she watched from the window, anticipating the moment her carefully planned prank would unfold. Today was the day she would finally teach him a lesson. She took a long sip of her steaming coffee, unable to contain her excitement. This man had been abusing her yard for his convenience, but today, he was going to learn a costly lesson. Her eyebrows raised when she saw movement on the other side of the fence. She watched as Owen tossed his bag into her yard, just like every other morning, but this time, it landed straight into her trap. She had to cover her mouth with her hand to stop herself from laughing. The bag had landed deep in the compost, and so did its contents. Everything inside was ruined. Sadie whispered a triumphant yes, as she watched Owen pull himself over the fence and fall straight into her trap, thick, disgusting compost instead of her flowers. His shocked scream echoed through the yard, and Sadie grinned. But as she prepared to laugh in his face, she noticed a snake slithering away, adding to Owen's terror. Covered in compost and slipping in the mess, Owen yelled, furious. Sadie leaned against the wall smirking. Sticky situation, huh? She teased. Furious, Owen grabbed his things and jumped back over the fence. Before he left, Sadie warned, next time, it'll be worse than compost. Owen nodded, and from that day on, he stopped using her yard as a shortcut, taking the long way around as she had asked. Her flowers recovered, and Sadie was finally rid of her problem.